72nd church to talk to. And
first in your heart.
it's so nice to be someplace where I know the people. I've been talking to strangers for 4 months, and so I really look forward to being here with you today. So I've been trying to think about how to get this talk to all of you today, because I think we've been talking about parts of this for a while, so I don't really want to be repetitive, but there's really two things that I have been talking with churches about. The first one is the denominational, what is happening in our denomination, and if you read the newspaper, you know we've made the news 4 weeks in a row now, and most of it hasn't been great. So I do want to talk about that and make sure that you do understand what is happening. I cannot tell you what will happen, because once General Conference meets, all bets are off. I can't tell you what they will decide. I can give you some scenarios maybe of what might happen. But more importantly, I think than our denominational conflict is the discussion on how we continue to be faithful to the mission God has given us as the church in the midst of a culture that is very different from the one that most of us grew up in, and one that most of us have lived in for a good share of our lives. And so it's a little bit frustrating to me that the conflict kind of keeps taking all of our time and our energy in our discussions, when if we can solve this conflict, but if we don't figure out how to carry out the mission of the church, we're still going to be closed in 20 years. Almost all of the churches that I talk to, that is the message. We have a much bigger issue that I think we need to figure out. So I'm going to get the denominational stuff out of the way first, as quickly as I can, and I don't mean to downplay it or diminish it. It's just that so much of it is not really in our hands at the denominational level, but at the church level, we have a lot that we can do. So I hope that you hear that. So I had this talk that I had been giving to all of these churches up until January 4th. And January 4th and 5th, I was up on the Iron Range, and I had 5 churches to visit in 2 days up on the Iron Range. And the Washington Post broke the story that the United Methodist Church had split. And so I had 5 churches ask me, what do we do now that the denomination has split? And that was not a true story. The denomination has not split, which I'm sure you have figured out by now. And the denomination cannot, the only body in our denomination that has the authority to make a decision like that is General Conference. And General Conference meets in May in Minneapolis. And so that can't happen before that. What did happen, though, really did change the conversation. And so I had to really change my presentation on the fly that weekend, because that news that came out, even though it wasn't a split, it was a protocol possibility that may be considered at General Conference that pretty much changes everything for the United Methodist Church in Minnesota. So we do have to take that into account. So, as you know, the General Conference session in February of 2019 was pretty much a disaster in the fact that we treated each other very poorly as a denomination. We called each other names, we ascribed terrible motives to each other, we accused each other of different things, and put on a pretty awful witness to the love and grace of Jesus Christ when we met in St. Louis in February. And so, and I think some of this might be a little bit of a review for you, but it is important to keep in mind. When annual conference came up a few months later after that, Minnesota loves to send legislation to General Conference. That's just a Minnesota thing. We love to vote on legislation at our annual conference and send it out to the General Conference. And Bishop O said, we are not going to do that this year. We are not going to repeat in Minnesota what happened in St. Louis in February. So I don't want you sending me a bunch of legislation that we're going to debate and get angry at each other over and repeat that performance. So we didn't. We had a couple of pieces of legislation. I think one that was sent on to General Conference that said that we were not happy with the plan that was adopted at General Conference in 2019, but there was a more important piece of legislation. And I can't remember whether I talked to you about this a lot or not, but it actually had to do with just how are we going to be together as Methodists in Minnesota, knowing that we don't agree on this issue. How are we going to be together? What will guide our behavior? What will guide our life together in Minnesota? So it was just for us. And they came up with what they called an aspirational vision. And it first came out of the Minnesota Methodists, which is a more progressive group that was kind of a grassroots movement that occurred after the 2019 General Conference. But then Bishop O called in every side of the issue. Representatives from the WCA, which is very traditional, representatives of UM Forward, UM Next, the Evangelical Ministers Network, the Minnesota Methodists, kind of all the different progressive, traditional, centrist representatives, and said, we need to work on this legislation so it is something that, by and large, most of us can get behind. So it started out coming from the Minnesota Methodists, but it was actually kind of tweaked and reworked until all the people at that table said, we think we could support this. The legislation had said there are 4 things that will guide our life together in Minnesota as Methodists. The first is that we are rooted and grounded in Jesus Christ. I mean, if that's not the foundation of all that we do, we might as well close our doors and go home. That is why we exist as a church. So we are rooted in Jesus Christ in our work and our life together. Secondly, we are grounded in our Wesleyan heritage and theology. And what I am discovering as I go around our district is that a lot of us are not sure what that means. I've had to spend actually the most amount of my time on that part of the vision. Most of you know I grew up Lutheran. I became a Methodist because of Wesleyan theology. I chose to be a Methodist because the backbone of Wesleyan theology is grace. It is a theology of grace. John Wesley lived 200 years after Martin Luther. He was able to take the work that Martin Luther had done as far as being saved by grace through faith and develop that into a more robust theology that says that God's grace is in this world before we even know there is a God. It's what makes the world even work. And that the more we respond to that grace, the more grace God pours out on us until we come to that point in our life when we can entrust our whole selves to God, to do with as God would wish to do. That our entire life is a growing in that grace and living in that grace of God. There's some other parts of Wesleyan theology and our heritage that I think are really important, though, for us to remember. And I think one of John Wesley's, maybe his most famous sermon, at least one of the most famous, is called A Catholic Spirit. And in A Catholic Spirit, John Wesley says, though we not all think alike, can we not all love alike? In other words, he knew we were going to disagree with each other. He'd been kicked out of so many churches. He knew that church people could disagree. And we could disagree over little things. We could disagree over major things. But what he was saying was, even though we disagree, can we still not love each other? And can we still not together love the world that God has called us to love? That's a major part of our heritage and our theology. It's why Methodism is called a big tent denomination. Because we have room for people to disagree with each other and yet remain together. There's another saying that Wesley said so often that a lot of people have said that he came up with this, but he didn't. He got this from the Moravian Church, which was very instrumental in John Wesley's salvation. But the saying is, in essentials, there must be unity. In other words, if we are going to be the church together, there have to be some things we agree on, right? I mean, for me, those have always centered around the creed. And what we say is the kind of the backbone of our belief. In essentials, as a church, we must have unity. In non-essentials, though, there can be liberty. In other words, we can agree to disagree on non-essentials. In all things, there must be love. Now, that comes out of the Moravian Church, and we have a Moravian pastor on this district. serving in Holly, Minnesota. So when I was at his church, he said, well, we were able to settle this in a very short amount of time, this whole issue of human sexuality. And I said, how did you do that? And he said, well, that's because we live by that saying. That's not just a saying for us that we put on the wall. We actually govern ourselves by that saying. So when the issue of different understandings of human sexuality and how we respond to that in the church came up in the Moravian church, their leadership of the denomination got together and they discussed it, and they came back and said, this is a non-essential. In other words, we can agree to disagree. According to that pastor, they had one conference where the clergy and the laity debated this and discussed it. They had one vote, and they went home. And it was solved. And they agreed that they could disagree. So churches could decide, pastors could decide, and follow their conscience. What has happened in our denomination is that we have raised this to the level of an essential. And both sides have done that. The progressives have said this is an issue of justice and discrimination, and it has to be the way I understand it, or it's wrong. And the traditionalists have raised it, saying this is an issue of biblical integrity, and if you don't understand that the way I do, then it's wrong, and I can't live with that. And so when we raised that to the level of an essential, it offers no way for us to bridge the gap. And that's where we find ourselves today. So up until 2 weeks ago, we had 6 different plans that I knew of going to General Conference to deal with this issue of human sexuality in our denomination. One of the plans was the traditionalist plan. They were coming back with more elements that didn't get passed in 2019 that they wanted to bring back in 2020. And specifically, what they wanted to bring back was that every Board of Ordained Ministry would have to question every candidate for ministry regarding their sexuality, and then certify that they would only pass along heterosexual candidates for ordination. And bishops would have to sign off on that certification. That did not get passed in 2019. They were bringing that back in 2020. There are some other issues as well, but that was kind of a big one. And if you do remember, what did get passed in 2019 concerns same-sex marriage and clergy. Beginning January 1st of this year, if a clergy person performs a same-sex marriage and charges are brought, that clergy person is automatically suspended for a year without pay. If they do it again, they lose their credentials and they can never again be a United Methodist pastor. That right now is our book of discipline. Now, a lot of people have talked about how punitive that is, and what they mean by that is that that's the only thing in the book of discipline that a clergy person could do that has automatic consequences. I could embezzle money from the church, and I am sure that if I'm caught, there will be legal consequences, and I'm sure that the bishop would also have something to say about that, but it's not spelled out in the book of discipline what the punishment for that is. I could have an affair and destroy my marriage and destroy somebody else's marriage. And that's not illegal anymore. The bishop, I think, would certainly have something to say about that, but there is no language in the book of discipline that says this is the automatic punishment for doing something like that. It's only this is the only thing that a clergy person can do that has an automatic punishment attached to it. So that's why if you hear people saying this is a punitive plan, that's what they are referring to. Now, there is a reason why that was brought to General Conference, and I want to try to be fair on all sides here. One of the reasons that the traditional, the WCA and some of those groups brought this to General Conference is because depending on which conference you were a part of, we have clergy people breaking the covenant, as they call it. Our current book of discipline says we're not allowed to perform same-sex marriages, and we had clergy that were doing that. If you were from maybe the California conference, and charges are brought because you've done that, the just resolution might be, I think you should go sit on the beach for a day and think about what you've done. If you were in Alabama and you did that, you might lose your ordination. So I mean, it was just it wasn't fair across, and it really bothered people that we have a book of discipline, and we have this language in it, and then we have clergy who are breaking the book of discipline and not having any consequences. So they put in automatic consequences. So there is a reason. That didn't just come out of thin air. There's a reason why they went that direction. That's one of the plans. Another plan was to completely dissolve the United Methodist Church entirely. There would be no more United Methodist Church. And we would sell all of the denominational assets, liquefy them. And then we would divide that money up, and we'd form 3 new denominations. One for traditionalists, one for centrists, and one for progressives. That one, I don't think ever, I would be really surprised if that would get much traction, because almost immediately statements were being released from Africa and from Asia and from the Philippines saying we do not support the dissolution of the United Methodist Church. They recognized right away what the consequences would be for them if the United Methodist Church ceased to exist. So then we also had some plans that said, well, let's keep the denomination together kind of as an umbrella. And that way we can keep UMCOR, and we can keep the General Board of Global Missions, and we can keep the General Board of Discipleship, and our seminaries, and our hospitals, and we'll keep all of that stuff, up here as an umbrella. But underneath that, then, we'll try to find somewhere where we can divide and contextualize our ministry based on where we're located. That's very, very complicated to do that, and would have taken years to make those changes in the Book of Discipline. But there were about 3 plans that said that. Another really likely option would be for General Conference to stalemate and not do anything. They have a 40-year history of doing that. So it's really not out of bounds to say that that could very well happen. But then 2 weeks ago, we made the news. And 2 weeks ago, it was released that there had been a group of people meeting secretly, and they were meeting secretly so that they didn't have the pressure of the media influencing their work all the time. They wanted to be able to sit down and negotiate and see if they could come to a better resolution without all kinds of added pressure. So it was actually a bishop from Africa, Bishop Yambasu, who contacted some of the people from the different movements within the United Methodist denomination. Reconciling Ministries, which is very progressive, Wesley Covenant Association, and Good News, and Institute for Religious, IRD, Religious Democracy, what is that? Anyway, IRD, I know, they're very traditional. UM Next, which is centrist, UM Forward, which is more progressive, that he got representatives from all of those different factions to sit around the table together and to try to figure out a way forward. And they did that for 3 months, 3 days a month at a time, and then they hired a mediator, a very well-known mediator, to sit with this group and try to see if we could figure out a plan that everybody could live with. And that's what was released at January 4th. It was leaked to the Washington Post, so then the group tried to release it as soon as they could before that. So the plan, I think a lot of people are really hopeful that this plan could pass because all the different sides kind of signed off on it. So can it gain some traction, and can it actually get through General Conference? The plan says that the most traditional part of the church, the most conservative, would leave the United Methodist Church and form a new denomination. And they would get $25 million from the United Methodist Church as startup money to do that. Then the more centrist, or as I call it, compatible parts of the United Methodist Church, the progressive and centrist, and those traditionalists who didn't want to leave, they would be the continuing United Methodist Church. And there was also $39 million set aside for ministry and outreach to those who are marginalized, who we have tended to ignore or push to the side. Kind of some justice and reconciliation kinds of money. I'm skipping around here, so I'm going to have to go back a little bit. But anyway, that's part of the plan as well. And then that continuing United Methodist Church would be broken down into 4 different jurisdictions. And there would be a new, if this were to pass at General Conference, this General Conference would be followed by another General Conference very quickly. And in that general conference, we would be divided into 4 jurisdictions. There would be a North American jurisdiction, a Eurasian jurisdiction, a Philippine jurisdiction, and an African jurisdiction. And each book of discipline would be contextualized to fit the jurisdiction, the culture of the jurisdiction where it is. So in the North American jurisdiction, I am sure that the words, we believe that the practice of homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching, would immediately be removed from our book of discipline, as would the prohibition against clergy performing same-sex marriages. I think that would probably also happen in Europe, but not in Africa, because in Africa, it's against the law. It can be imprisonment or the death penalty. For that. So it's necessary that there is some contextualization, but that is kind of that plan to do that. That plan came out after the deadline for submitting legislation to General Conference. So it has a complicated road to even be considered. It has to have, I think it's at least 2 annual conferences have to call a special meeting and request that this plan be placed before the General Conference delegates for it even to get there. And I don't know if it's even been turned into legislation yet. I'm hoping that it has. I know they're working on translation right now. But it's quite a complicated process to get the plan even to the General Conference. And then there is no guarantee that it will be considered at General Conference even if it gets there. What happens at General Conference is kind of a mystery. Every plan goes to a legislative committee, and it can be changed and revised, and parts taken out and parts added, and so you don't, and then you don't know which plan seriously those delegates will vote up to really look at. So it's not a guarantee that that will be the plan that we have when General Conference ends. It's a possibility, but there is no guarantee. So going back to Minnesota's vision, the third part of that vision, and this is the important one for us to remember, I think, is we said we will be inclusive of all people in all aspects of the life of the church without exception. No exceptions. That particular provision had to deal directly with LGBTQIA persons, that we will not exclude them from any part of the life of the church. And then the fourth thing was that we are committed to justice and reconciliation, and that has to do with racial justice and reconciliation. That we recognize that we have not dealt with that in our churches. And it was interesting, at annual conference last year, we had a group of ethnic pastors who stood up and said, "You all have not address this fully. We do experience racism when we are placed in cross-cultural appointments." And so those things, rooted in Jesus Christ, grounded in Wesleyan theology and heritage, inclusive of all people, and committed to justice and reconciliation, we said that is our aspirational vision for how we will be as Methodists in Minnesota now, when the denomination is trying to figure this out, and going forward. So that sort of tells you where the Minnesota Annual Conference is at and where they want to stay. So that has consequences for what will happen here, no matter what General Conference does. If General Conference votes up more of the traditional plan, which I think is a distinct possibility. They had the votes last time, and there's nothing that tells me they won't have the votes this time. If they do that, then I think you would start to hear that Minnesota is looking at leaving the United Methodist Church and forming with other progressive conferences a new denomination. If they do nothing, and they just leave the language that is now in our Book of Discipline, I also think you will hear Minnesota looking at leaving the United Methodist Church and going with other progressive conferences into a new denomination. If the protocol that was released a couple of years ago passes, then I think Minnesota will stay in the United Methodist Church. And there are other conferences that will vote to leave the United Methodist Church, mainly I think in a lot in the Southeast. There may be some in the Great Plains area, but that's probably what we would see happening. So Is that clear so far? It feels kind of like mud, but do you understand that our vision has some consequences for steps that we will take following General Conference? What is not clear is what General Conference will do. We do not know what General Conference will do. What we have decided is that in Minnesota, we will be inclusive. We will be, now that doesn't mean that we won't have room for traditional churches in Minnesota. There is nobody that is interested in going to a church and telling them, you have to allow same-sex marriage in your church, or your pastor has to perform same-sex marriages, or you have to be open to receiving a gay clergy person. First of all, we don't have that many gay clergy persons, and they don't want to come up here. I mean, honestly, they don't want to leave the safety of the cities. But also, it is still up to local churches to decide how they are going to operate. So even if Minnesota goes progressive and you're not feeling like you're progressive, there's still a place for you within the Minnesota Annual Conference. We have tried to be very clear that inclusive means inclusive. And that's really hard. It is really hard to be inclusive when you start talking about people who have very different understandings of things. But that is a commitment that we have made. We're not there yet. I know a lot of people left Annual Conference feeling like their voice wasn't welcome. Like they were looked down on because they held a different view from the majority. So we have a lot of work to do, I think, as clergy and churches in Minnesota to live into that vision, but that is what we have said is our vision of the church that we want to be here in Minnesota. So, do you have any questions on that? I will be having 3 district days in March 1st, March 7th, and February 29th. And one of them is going to be here. February 29th, I will be here. And that day I will talk about what those different plans are a little bit in more detail, or I'll have handouts at something. And I'll also talk about how do we handle the media, because we've just gotten a foretaste of what the media is going to be like. This General Conference is going to probably be divisive, and the media is going to be covering it extensively, especially because it's taking place in our backyard. And so, you know, when the Methodist Church hits the front page of the Star Tribune a couple weeks in a row, it can be likely that you can be at Walmart and have somebody say to you, you're part of the Methodist Church, aren't you? What in the world is going on in your church? I mean, it might be helpful to have thought ahead of time how you're going to respond to that, rather than just being totally caught off guard. And we've already had that happen. And I don't know if anybody's aware of the story on Cottage Grove. Yeah. So if anybody's interested, I can sort of tell you the real story. That was some pretty bad publicity that came out. And we did have churches, even as far out as this, being saying, so you belong to the church that practices ageism, that discriminates against older people? And no matter how many corrections and retractions and other statements that have come out saying that's not true, if you read the comment sections under those, people are hanging on to the fact that they believe this was a terrible thing and Satan has a grip on this church because we are discriminating against old people. So there will be a lot of media. And what's unfortunate is that when General Conference happens, I don't think that the media will be interested in reporting that we spent somewhere in the neighborhood of $4 billion through UMCOR responding to disasters around the world. I don't think they'll let people know that sometimes we're at a disaster faster than the Red Cross gets there. That stuff won't be what they report. What they'll report is the Methodists are fighting over the issue of human sexuality. So we will be talking about how we deal with that, and then what happens when the dust settles after General Conference. What will the leadership be? So, what I have been telling all of the churches in the North Star District, and we have churches, I have gone to churches that have said, before you say anything, we've got our reconciling statement here, we've already signed it, and you need to know that. We are a reconciling church, which means they're progressive. Or I've had churches that say, before you say anything, we're traditional and we don't want you to mess with that. We know how we understand the Bible and that's it. And then I've had a lot of churches that are really scared that they're going to have to vote. Because if they have to vote, They may lose 5 or 10 people, and that could be enough to close them. And so what I have told every church is, as the district superintendent, I am not here to try to make you something other than what you are. I'm here to encourage you to know who you are so that I can help you find the best path forward to do the ministry God has called you to do. Whether that is leaving our denomination, whether it is staying in our denomination, whether it is whatever it happens to be, I will help you, but I'm not going to try to convince you to be something that you're not, because that doesn't work. It just doesn't work. So unless you want to leave the Minnesota Annual Conference, chances are you will not have to vote. Only those churches that would want to leave where the conference is at would have to vote their way out of that. So, and with the Minnesota Annual Conference saying we still want to be the place where there's room for everybody, churches shouldn't have to do that if they don't want to do that. The one thing I have told a lot of churches is I don't think it's so important that you know whether you're progressive or whether you're traditional. What's really important is if you know if you're compatible or incompatible. And an incompatible church says, this is how I understand this issue, and I will not belong to any organization where anybody else understands it differently than I do. So you can have progressive incompatibilists who say, I understand this is an issue of discrimination, and I won't belong to a church where anybody discriminates. So that's it. You have traditional incompatibilists who say, this is how I understand the biblical teaching, and I won't be a part of a denomination where anybody understands it differently than I do. Compatibilists say, I understand this, I've studied it, I have an opinion on this, and this is what I believe, and this is how I believe my church will operate. But I can belong to an organization where other churches understand it differently and may operate differently than we do. You know, I can do my ministry here knowing that New City Church in the Twin Cities does their ministry in a different way, and that's okay. That's a compatibilist. In most of the, I've taken 4 national surveys where people have to rate where they are, and I think it represents where we are as a culture. 10% of the people identify as incompatibilists on each side. 10% say they're progressive incompatibilists, 10% say they're traditional incompatibilists, 80% of the people identify as compatibilists. They don't want to fight about it anymore. But they may say, I'm traditional, but I'm okay if other churches are progressive. Or they may say, I'm progressive, but I'm okay if other churches are traditional. If you're compatibilist, you don't have a problem in the Minnesota Annual Conference. If you're incompatible and you're traditional, you're going to just continue to have a conflict if you stay in the Minnesota Annual Conference. Because the conference leans progressive. We have traditional churches, we have traditional clergy, but as a whole, we lean progressive. That's where Minnesota is. So, any questions on that? Okay, good. Then here's what I'd really like to talk about. When I went to my 1 week of training to be a district superintendent, they did not teach me anything practical, like what forms have to be done and what order you do things or anything like that. They spent 4 days teaching us about culture change. Because if the church does not start to get this, we don't have a future. And so I would just like to talk with you about that a little bit. I think you're going to recognize a lot of this when I say this. From about the end of World War II, and probably in large part due to World War II, from about there until the mid-60s, we lived in what social scientists call a culture of convergence. And in a culture of convergence, the most important thing is the common good of all people. So if any of you can remember back to that time, I can, so I know some of you can too. During that period of time, our churches were full, right? Our churches were full. So were our service organizations. The Rotary Club, the Lions Club, the Kiwanis Club, you name it. They were all full of people who were willing to share their resources, their time, and their gifts to improve their community, the common good. It was a time when civility was more common than incivility. So even though we disagreed, we did it with respect. for each other. It was a time when the middle class was the fastest growing class in America. And corporations made money, but do you know how they invested their profits? In their communities. Because we were all working for the common good of all people. It was also a time when people had a very high trust in institutions. We had just come out of World War II, and we were a people who trusted our government, and we trusted our press, and we trusted our schools, and we trusted our churches. Very high trust in institutions. Could you even imagine anybody accusing Walter Cronkite of fake news? Like, it would never have been thought of, right? We had 1/2 hour a day of national news, 5 days a week, and we all thought that was enough. I mean, Walter told us what we needed to know, and if he didn't tell us, we probably didn't need to know it, right? When the first astronaut landed on the moon, 75% of all Americans watched that on the same television station. 75% of us were watching that event at the same time on the same news station. Now we have how many 24-hour news channels? And they're not based on a journalism model, they're based on an entertainment model of journalism. So, you know, when the impeachment inquiry started in the House of Representatives way back, when that started, I was listening to NPR as I was driving along, and one of the legal experts they had on there said, you know what distinguishes this impeachment inquiry from any that we've had before is that depending on which news station is your favorite, you won't just have a different opinion, you will have a different set of facts. That is where we are today. I was at my very first second church that I spoke to. I gave that example about the astronaut landing on the moon, and the pastor of that church, who is younger than me, said, and that never even really happened. That's what I did. I laughed. I thought he was making a joke. He was not joking. He was not joking. There's a whole movement out there that says unless you can prove it, I won't believe it. And he said the government needed a win at that time, and they convinced the press to go along with them to fool the entire nation that we had been to the moon. That is where we are today. In the 1960s, that whole culture of conversion started to fracture. We had the Vietnam War, and then we had the Vietnam War protests. And then people started to think, is our government really as deserving of our trust as we have given it? We had the rise of feminism and the civil rights movement, which were two huge groups of people who said, you know what? Not all of us are experiencing the common good in the same way. Not all of us are being elevated that way. And so that all kind of started to fracture, and what it has led to is the culture that we live in now. So if you remember what the culture was like, that convergent culture, we now live in a culture they call divergent. And they said this is the normative culture. We're not going back to convergence anymore, so we need to adjust. And in a divergent culture, the common good is not the most important thing. Personal preference is number one. So we demand that we have 3 or more news stations because we want to choose what kind of news that we listen to. When people move to town, they don't say, where are the Methodist churches? They say, where is the church that plays the kind of music that I like, that preaches the way, the sermons that I want to hear, the message that I want to hear, that offers my kids what I want my kids to have, that takes the stands that are important to me on justice issues? That is what people are thinking when they're looking, if they're looking at choosing a church. So a culture of divergence is marked by personal preference, incivility, and you only have, I mean, the news is enough, but go on social media and you can see incivility all over the place if you want to. It's also marked, though, by a very low trust in institutions. We do not trust our government. We do not trust our press. We do not trust our schools. We have questioned now so many different segments of education that we never used to question before. and we do not trust our churches. And as a church, we have got to get that. People do not trust us. We have to earn their trust. It's not something that we automatically get from people. We have to earn it. The other thing that has changed, the whole culture has changed. When I grew up, we moved from Minnesota to Carrington, North Dakota. And my mom's number one job was to find the Lutheran church in town. And within 2 weeks, we were members and enrolled in Sunday school. Because that's just the way it was, right? And we never missed a week. Regular attendance at church meant every time they unlocked the door for my family. But for most people, it was at least every week, unless you were gone or sick, you were at church. And my mom did not work until I was in high school. She stayed home. Sports were for a season. So you had the season of volleyball and a season of basketball. And you had a season for track or whatever, but it's very different than what families experience now. Families experience two parents working. Their time is their most important asset that they have. And if they want their kids to play in sports, it's year-round. When I first started in ministry, I really hated hockey because I had 3 female hockey players in my church, and it was absolutely impossible to find time for confirmation class because it was year-round, it was every weekend, and it was every night of the week. It's not just hockey anymore. It's volleyball, it's basketball, softball, hockey. They're year-round. If you want your child to compete, they have to be committed year-round to that sport. So it's way different. So, for young families who do go to church, when they say they attend regularly, Gallup did some further research on that. What they mean by regular attendance at church is once every 4 to 6 weeks. That's regular attendance. And for families who are that overcommitted and time is their most valuable resource, that's probably what they believe they can manage, is once every 4 to 6 weeks. So if we want to be serious about reaching young families, we have to take that into consideration. I remember talking to pastors in the Twin Cities that have large churches that have the full-blown Sunday school. And they said, even our most committed families are here 50% of the time. So how do you do that traditional Sunday school model where every lesson follows every lesson when half of your class, at least, will be gone every Sunday? We have to figure out, they're not going to adjust to us. So we have to figure out how to adjust to them. And I think we've done some adjusting. I really do. I've gone into a lot of churches. This has been eye-opening for me. But I've gone into a lot of churches where I think people feel really bad and they feel like they have failed. Because they don't have any young families in their church. They don't have any children in their church. Their church is getting smaller every year. And they feel like they've done something wrong. And a lot of what I've said is, I don't think you did anything wrong. The culture changed. And you weren't prepared for it. When I was growing up, I grew up in a small town. And I know not all of you did, but everybody in the town where I lived went to church. Everybody. I didn't know a single person in my town that was not connected with the church. I didn't know a single kid in my school that didn't go to church on Sundays. So we didn't talk a lot about reaching out to our neighbors with the good news of Jesus Christ because for Pete's sake, they all went to church. They knew it. So that wasn't our mission. If I had to say a mission for the church that I grew up in, it would have been transmitting the faith to the next generation. That was where our time and our energy and our resources went. Sunday school was really important. Vacation Bible School was 2 weeks long, every day, all day. Youth group was important. Confirmation class was a huge deal. Because that was the mission of the church, to transmit the faith to the next generation. I think maybe 20 or 25 years ago, we started realizing we didn't have much of the next generation in our church. That couldn't be our main mission because they weren't there. So we realized we had to reach out into our communities, and I think we have done a great job of that. I have been in so many small towns where I have said, if the churches in this town disappeared, so would the safety net for people. Because who is keeping the food shelf stocked? Who is delivering Meals on Wheels? Who is mentoring kids? Who is checking on senior citizens? It's church people who are doing that. So we've done a really good job, I think, of that third gospel imperative of healing a broken world or reaching out to our community. What we haven't done is translated that into discipleship. We've had a lot of people say, boy, aren't they great people? They just, they do so many great things in the community. We haven't connected what we do to a life in Jesus Christ. That's a much harder leap to make than to just volunteer at the food shelf. It's much harder to figure out, how do I share with the people that I'm reaching out to that I do this because of the love I have received from Jesus Christ, and I want them to experience that same love and grace. That's a much harder thing, and I think that's the issue that is facing this church. We did a great job starting 30 years ago of saying we will be the best church. If you're over 55, we are like the church for you. Because we've got it going on for that age. We did a great job of that, and we actually turned this church around from death to life and growth. But in a sense, we had some low-hanging fruit, because all of those people turning 55 30 years ago had been going to church their whole lives. So we just had to convince them to go to our church, right? Now the people turning 55 may not have been going to church for the last 20 or 30 or 40 years. So how do we convince them, not just that we're the church for them, but to go to church in the first place? This isn't just an issue for churches that are trying to fill their Sunday school rooms or reach out to young families. This is an issue facing all of us now. How do we effectively share the good news of Jesus Christ in a way that people can receive it? How do we do that? And the one thing we have to understand is the culture that we live in. We can't expect people to change to become like us. We have to adapt ourselves to the culture. So I've been at a few churches that have said, we had somebody come and we said, man, we haven't seen you since Easter. What brings you to church? Well, you know what? You're probably not going to see him again. We have to figure, those messages don't help. That family may have just done the best they could to get there this Sunday. And maybe it's been 2 months since they were there. We cannot give out any messages of judgment on how often people come to church. We have to be glad when they're here. I think we have to figure out how to slide our understanding of the love and grace of Jesus Christ into the cracks and crevices in people's lives where they have room to receive it. Because people are overstressed and overcommitted these days. So if we're just wanting to add one more thing to their list of things they have to do, they're not probably going to be very receptive to that. So how do we do it in a way that is easy for them? So one of the things is online. Minnesota last year increased their average worship attendance for the first time in almost forever. Probably since we've been tracking it. We increased our average worship attendance. We did that by offering online worship for people. There's a couple of churches that have invested so that they can live stream their services. So people can attend church when it is happening with their church family, but not have to go. And for some families, that's the way to do it. And, I don't get that personally. I grew up going to church, and I like the community that is a part of church. I like being there.